Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name's Grace McLean. I'm a writer. I've written 3 novels. I live in London. On this channel so far I've been doing anything I fancied really, but recently I've been uploading videos about books because I thought that might actually help people write a novel if they want to. And today the topic is pitfalls of novel writing. When I was preparing this, I actually thought it'd be quite funny if someone wrote a whole novel deploying all these pitfalls, but then I thought actually no, it might be quite boring to read because I guess there is only one pitfall really, which is being boring. So as long as you keep the reader's interest, you can do pretty much whatever you want. You just have to get them to keep turning the pages. I also want to say to begin with that all these pitfalls are taken from a brilliant book which I read when I was writing my novels. I think it's called How Not to Write a Novel. There were 2 books and the second book to a lesser degree. In fact, sometimes it was just really humorous to read and kind of got my headspace into a lighter vein, because when you're really trying hard to write, you can get very serious. But it was also really practical, and this was the book by Mittelmark and Newman, How Not to Write a Letter, How Not to Write a Novel. And these tips are taken from that book. So this video is comprised of what I feel are the most valuable points from that book. I'm digging out the gems, with a few of my own observations thrown in. This video is divided into 3 parts: beginnings, complications, and endings. No, it isn't. It isn't. This video is divided into 10 parts. Okay. Beginnings is my first section. The first pitfall I've called the agony of infinite deferral. This means you never get to the point. This can be done consciously and very cleverly in a book such as The Unconsoled by Kazuo Ishiguro, or Kafka does it all the time. And usually those writers that deploy it brilliantly are making an existential point about the lack of meaning. Sebald is another example, and actually Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. You could say that nothing happens for the whole book, but actually that book is contested. I mean, its greatness is contested, so maybe that's not a good example of someone who brilliantly deploys this. But in lots of fledgling writers' novels, this happens to the detriment of the overall novel and not consciously at all. And this is particularly a problem at the beginning of a novel, where there can be endless scenes establishing background information with no main story in sight. In this scenario, the reader creates an entire world in which nothing really happens. When meaning is infinitely deferred and it works, I think it's because the writer is making us feel that everything we're reading is resonant and deep. I guess the perfect example of this would be 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. You feel constantly as if you're on the cusp of discovering something, and I guess the brilliance is that lasts right to the end page, where you feel cheated, but again you think, maybe that's the point. In those writers that are trying to make an existential point about the lack of meaning in experience, they have a deep philosophical bone to pick or issue to work out, and I think their emotional and intellectual investment in that is contagious, and that is what makes the reader keep reading. Even if they don't exactly understand what's being interrogated, they can feel the energy and the urgency of it. The second point is a follow-on to the first. Avoid creating scenes where a character merely mulls over background information, which can again often happen at the beginning of a not terribly well-written novel. It's infinitely more effective if characters have thoughts about their lives while they're immersed and embroiled in action. So rather than have long discourses or ruminative passages, floating separately from dialogue and action. Try and embed those passages in a relevant way, in a dynamic context. The third point is, I think, the most important in this section about beginnings, and that is look closely at your novel and decide what the first important event is and cut everything before that. The second section I've termed complications. The first pitfall is called the red herring, which is an element introduced at the beginning of the novel that seems so significant the reader can't help but keep an eye on it, but it never does come into play and the reader feels cheated. Second pitfall is related to the first, and that is if a character is going to do something at a key moment or at the end of the book, it should seem congruent. So embed clues and pointers directing the reader's attention so that when the key element is revealed at the end of the book or at any stage in the book, it doesn't feel like it's come out of nowhere. So for example, you want your characters to save the day with a special skill. You need to introduce that skill earlier. And the more unlikely the event, the more rooted it has to be in the character and in the narrative. Sometimes a remark made innocently on the author's part can be interpreted as full of meaning by the reader, without the author intending that at all. This can happen, for example, if dialogue is too straightforward and unequivocal, or simply in the way a detail is mentioned or where it's mentioned. The third section is called endings, and the first pitfall is called Deus Ex Machina. The reader should be interested in the way the character resolves her problems. This is as much fun as when someone suddenly, unequivocally changes the rules of a game you're playing. The second pitfall is called the homily. And this can happen in quite lauded novels and esteemed novels. In fact, it happens all too bloody often. The author, at the last minute, because they haven't done it before, suddenly says everything they want to say, all their themes, all their philosophical points, all their moral contentions. These things should have been dramatized already. If the author says these things briefly, or in a manner of speaking at the end, I think it's okay. It's just when they haven't even been alluded to before. That's the problem. The fourth section is called character. And the first pitfall we've kind of touched on, and that is sometimes a fledgling writer will think that simply by describing the details of a character's life, they're making that character live for the reader, when often this isn't the case. So the remedy, as mentioned before, is to cut to the first significant action. The second pitfall is called compassion fatigue. If a character really is a victim and has the whole world against him or her, then it's actually hard to engage the reader, because the reader will think there's no hope of things changing, and there needs to be tension between things possibly changing and the character working towards that change, sometimes very desperately, and the other alternative of nothing changing. If it's clear nothing's going to change, it's not that interesting to read. I've just read a novel which would seem to contradict this advice, called No Longer Human, by a Japanese writer called Osamu Dazai. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. And in that novel, which is possibly, apart from some of Kafka's work, the bleakest novel I've ever read, a deeply dysfunctional, hopeless, shame-ridden and tragic character stumbles his way through life, from suicide attempt to breakdown to failed relationship after failed relationship, and he says openly that there's no hope for him. And I was saying when I began this that in that case there is no progression, and this would seem to contradict the point that the reader needs a tension between hope and no hope. But actually in that novel he manages to sink to deeper and deeper depths, so maybe there is change and not hope, but the loss of more and more hope, even though you didn't think that was possible. So maybe that does conform to this rule. The third pitfall is called the Faceless Multitude, in which numerous extras are introduced for no good reason. Unless someone figures in the plot, they don't need to be there. Or we don't need to meet them, at least. A novel can't afford to carry the dead weight. The fourth pitfall is creating a character that the reader doesn't understand. This means the reader doesn't understand their motivations to act. So you could have a psychopath which the general reader wouldn't relate to, such as Patrick Bateman in American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, and still engage the reader and to some extent make the reader empathise with the character, because we see in the course of that novel that actually the real villain is the capitalist society that Patrick is himself a victim of. Yes, he is a psychopath, but we can relate to him to some extent, and so we understand his motivations, again, to some extent. And of course there's a strong element of fascination with an evil character. But beware of creating a character that the reader can't get inside to some extent or relate to. The fifth section is called style. The main point of this is that writing should be transparent and not draw attention to itself, which again is easily contested by brilliant experimental novels such as A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, or very erudite novels such as Ben Lerner's work, where even very well-educated people continually have to reach for their dictionaries. But as a rule of thumb, writing should be clear, and it should be as simple as it can be. So there's no need for words such as exclaimed, divulged, ejaculated, even replied, and some writers even elide the word said, because all of those things takes the reader out of the book. It reminds them they are reading a book, and it takes them out of the world that the book's created. In a way, the book is like just a pane of glass, so it shouldn't draw attention to itself, and neither should the writing. Again, this is contradicted by brilliant stylists such as Cormac McCarthy, in which the language is so rich that we are conscious we're reading. So many of these principles can be contested. I think the main point to take home though is, as a beginner writer, it's really good to master these basic skills and avoid these pitfalls, and then in time you can elaborate and bend the rules a bit. But first of all, you've got to learn how to do things well in a basic way, just as an artist needs to learn how to draw the anatomy in a realistic way and a true to life way before they can abstract it. The second pitfall related to style is cliché. Hot-blooded, her mind was a whirlwind. Powerful embrace shattered the silence, life was cheap. You get the picture. The third pitfall is beware of exclamation marks. This was something I really struggled with in my first novel, because there was a child narrator and I couldn't think of how to get across how excited she sometimes was or how frightened. Italics and caps. Ideally they should be used never, unless knowingly. That goes for all of these points, unless knowingly. The fourth pitfall is tautologies. If you've said something one way, there's no way to say it another, such as large grey elephant. So just beware of redundancies in general. The fifth pitfall is called the Faulkner Effect, named after William Faulkner. It could be called the Joyce Effect, or now the McBride Effect. This is using very complex, dense, and pretty impenetrable language for the everyday reader. Now, many prize-winning and classic novels have used this language, but again, as a beginner novelist, it's best to make your language clear. At the other end of the scale, if there are inconsistencies in grammar, spelling, punctuation, that really needs to be cleaned up. So the prose has to be tight, clean, and devoid of reiteration and redundancy. If you're sending your manuscript to an agent, then that's the most basic thing to get sorted out. Concluding words on the subject of experimentation. I think the main point here is that if a writer's being arcane or clever or erudite for the sake of it, it kind of shows and alienates the reader. Whereas if the experimentation or complexity is forced upon the medium by what he or she is trying to say, then that means the style is integrated into the whole and not floating separately from it, and then it can be very, very powerful. The sixth section is called dialogue, and there's basically only one pitfall here, apart from having wildly unrealistic dialogue and the danger of accents. And that pitfall is naming characters continuously. So if you've named who's speaking in the previous sentence, there's no need to name them again. And sometimes, if there's only one person at the forefront of the reader's consciousness, they don't have to be named for page after page. Much of J.M. Coetzee's fiction is a case in point. The seventh section is to do with point of view. I noticed that quite a few students wobbled a little bit in their point of view. So they would be describing one character and then segue seamlessly into another character's consciousness, which made the reader think, one, the character was suddenly telepathic, and two, in the worst cases, sometimes see through what the writer was trying to do. If you need to get across information about another character, then the thing to do is dramatize that properly, devoting time to them and giving them their own point of view. If something is worth describing, it's worth dramatizing and giving that character their own point of view. In some cases, all you need to do is make your first character hypothesize about what may be going on in the life and mind of another character, and that gets around the problem. But they can't empirically know, as a third-person omniscient narrator would. I think a really good novel to study point of view, multiple points of view, is Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. During the course of the novel, she delves into, I'd say, at least about 5 different characters' consciousness. We're never confused about which character we're with. The difficult bit, the transitions, are really worth studying because they happen so naturally. Last point's about point of view. If you've chosen a restricted point of view at the beginning of the novel, you have to stick with it. But there really aren't any restrictions, and a fascinating example of this is Cormac McCarthy, who, setting aside the road, in the rest of his fiction, very rarely tells us what a character's thinking. He only ever shows what they're doing. And he manages to convey universes without ever overtly entering the mind of any particular character. The second pitfall in this section about point of view is to be aware of shifting into another tense, unaware. The 8th section is interior monologue. A common characteristic of unpublished manuscripts is a massively disproportionate ratio of inner contemplation to action. Inner monologue and and rumination and contemplation can be very boring for a reader. I think a massive thing to take away from this is to remember that your reader is a real person. They're not some abstract ideal who will put up with anything and love everything. They're just a real person, and if a real person is bored with something in real life, they'll be bored with something in a novel. A novel is real life. So don't bore your reader. Published novels supply a steady stream of action, and interior monologue, if it happens, is threaded gracefully throughout. The 9th section is themes. The first point is that even a theme most readers would be on board with, such as love conquers all, can become irritating if it's stated and not dramatised. It can also be unconvincing. Further to that, there's not really much point in a writer labouring to stress a theme that everyone already agrees with, such as racism is bad. A note about symbols. Your novel should work just as well for the reader that doesn't pick up on any symbols you may have embedded in the text at all. Hopefully this is the case with my novels, because even reviewers and critics didn't pick up on a lot of the symbolism, but narrative and plot were okay. The 10th and last section is a roundup of pitfalls I noticed when I was working as a tutor with MA and PhD creative writing students. Even in the most promising and talented writers, some of these things cropped up time and time again. The first being, they just weren't writing clearly enough. Clarity is such a powerful thing, and that goes along with simplicity. They go hand in hand. And fledgling writers just often don't write clear sentences. But this includes clarity on a larger scale as well. In a novel, you have to signal certain things to a reader clearly. And there can be good uncertainty and bad uncertainty. Good uncertainty is when a reader wants to know more about a character, when there's a mystery they're dying to unpick. And bad uncertainty is when they're just labouring to make their way through muddy sentences with lots of redundancies, lots of unnecessary flourishes. Good uncertainty is when a reader isn't entirely sure of the specifics of events and characters, and of course the deliberate withholding of a key piece of information from them on the part of the writer. Bad uncertainty is when the reader doesn't know who's speaking, where they and the characters are, who the protagonist is, what they care about, what they want, why this is so, what they intend to do about it. Essentially, the reader doesn't know why they're reading on. And if this uncertainty goes on long enough, the reader will put the book down. A last word to say about clarity. By conveying things to the reader very early on, you're on a winning streak, because you've captured their attention and you've fueled their motivation to read on. So make them clear about the important things from the get-go, and conceal what you want to conceal from them, but make them aware something is concealed from them. Make them want to work out what you want them to work out. So clarity at the sentence level, and clarity at the plot level, and clarity at every level. As I said in the video, How to Write a Good Novel, ideally and nearly always, in fact, possibly always, a character needs to have a problem, no matter how small, and the reader needs to know what the problem is and know what the character intends to do about it. In some of Kafka's stories, the problem can be so small. In one, I think it's an unexplained noise, but the fact is the problem is there. Further to the last point, it's not just enough to have a character with a problem. The character has to be interesting in some way, because everyone in real life has problems. You know, getting the government to give you money when you're on job seekers allowance, a divorce, a bereavement, an alcohol problem, a horrible boss. So it's not just enough to give a character a problem. The character needs to interest the reader in some way, be fascinating in some way. You have to give them a little hook so that the reader keeps reading. Be aware of the possibilities of immeasurably strengthening your work by cutting everything that is not absolutely necessary. I think a great novel to read that shows the energy and sheer joy that a well-pruned novel can give a reader is The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night Time by Mark Haddon. Something I do notice a lot in students' work is the old adage, which is still relevant, that it's always better to dramatise something rather than state something. It's more engaging for the reader, but it does mean more work on the writer's part because you have to think. The fifth point is related to something I talked about in my earlier video, How to Write a Good Novel, and that is every event needs to be linked to the event before it and the event that comes after it, in a chain where each event is a link, rather than beads on a necklace. This gives the reader momentum to read forward and also makes things congruent because the reader can see where something has come from and where it's going. Because real life is a bit like a necklace. Things apparently seem to happen quite randomly and without much coherence. But a novel, at least for writers that are beginning, each event needs to connect the past to the future and dramatise how the protagonist goes about trying to get what they want. This also ensures that nothing is superfluous. And that concludes this video about the pitfalls of novel writing. I hope some of you found this helpful, and I'll see you again soon. Bye bye.